Right now, somewhere in the middle of the ocean, a massive 20-year-old oil tanker has just gone completely dark.
Yeah, just totally off the grid.
Right. I mean, the captain reached up, flipped a switch, and turned off the ship's automatic tracking beacons. So they are sailing in the pitch black, carrying 1 million barrels of crude oil, flying a flag they probably bought online a week ago.
And operating with completely fraudulent insurance papers.
Yes, all of that. And you might wonder why. Well, because there is a geopolitical fortune to be made in the shadows. Welcome to Reform Thinking.
Thanks for having me back.
Absolutely. Today, we are undertaking a thorough deep dive into a subject that sits right at the intersection of global geopolitics and eternal spiritual truths. We are looking at the economic sanctions placed on Russia's oil trade due to the unprovoked aggression of the Ukraine-Russia war.
Specifically, we are analyzing the rise of the billion-dollar shadow fleet.
Right. That massive network of evasion tankers designed to bypass international law. But we are not stopping at the geopolitical facts. We are taking this entire international standoff with all its intricate financial maneuvering and using it to illustrate the Reformed doctrines of common grace and total depravity.
That is the real core of our discussion today.
I think so too. Whether you are filling up your gas tank on the way to work or watching the evening news, the invisible war over oil logistics affects your wallet. But more than that, it reveals undeniable spiritual realities about the fallen world we live in.
Our mission for this deep dive is to analyze the mechanics of modern economic warfare. We're going to examine the difference between sanctions that successfully bite into an aggressor's economy and sanctions that leak through the cracks of human corruption.
The bite versus the leak.
Yes. And we will look at why secular pragmatism consistently fails to account for the deceitful nature of the human heart. The world attempts to build airtight legal systems, assuming that humans are rational actors who can be managed through the right financial incentives.
But that never quite works out, does it?
No, it does not. As we will see, a system designed by fallen human beings will always be vulnerable to the ingenuity of sin. We are going to break down the timeline of these sanctions, the physical reality of the shadow fleet, and the theological framework that helps you make sense of all this without losing your hope in the sovereign rule of Christ.
Let's start with the basic architecture of authority. When we talk about international sanctions, freezing assets, and restricting trade, we are really talking about the exercise of authority by the state.
Which is a biblical concept.
Right. You often hear news anchors discuss these actions in terms of international law or United Nations resolutions, but we need to look at this through the lens of Scripture. If a government decides to step in and crush the economy of a foreign aggressor, how does the Bible define their authority to do that?
To understand the authority behind these sanctions, we must turn to Romans 13, verses 1 through 4. The Apostle Paul, writing to a Christian church residing in the very heart of the Roman Empire, lays down a coherent argument regarding the origin and purpose of civil government.
And he was writing to people under a very harsh government.
Oh, absolutely.
Mhm.
But he establishes that all earthly authority is a delegated stewardship from God. It is tasked with the specific moral burden of restraining evil and promoting the good. When we look at the Greek syntax of verse 4, Paul calls the magistrate the diakonos of God.
The servant of God.
Yes, the servant. This means the state's authority is not inherent. It is derivative and accountable to the Creator. But the most critical term for our discussion of sanctions is machera, which is translated as the sword. Paul says the magistrate does not bear the sword in vain.
And that specific word choice matters a lot.
It does. It is fascinating to notice that Paul uses the word machera. That was the short sword or dagger carried by Roman officials for everyday enforcement of judicial and police duties.
So like a policeman's sidearm today.
Precisely. He did not use the word rhomphaia. The rhomphaia is the large, double-edged apocalyptic sword we see in the book of Revelation. So the machera represents practical, earthly enforcement of justice and wrath upon evildoers. It is a tool of immediate temporal restraint.
So if the machera is a short sword for practical everyday policing, that completely alters how we view economic policy. I look at the year 2026, and I see that the magistrate's sword does not always look like a steel blade.
No, it looks very different now.
Think of the magistrate's sword today not as a physical weapon, but as a digital ledger or a sweeping trade embargo. The force is economic, but the intent is identical to the Roman official carrying a short sword.
And the geopolitical facts show us the massive scale of this modern sword.
Oh, it is massive. We are looking at the freezing of approximately $300 billion in Russian sovereign reserves. Just think about that number for a second. $300 billion sitting in central banks across the globe, frozen with a few keystrokes.
Just locked away instantly.
Right. We are also looking at the expulsion of major Russian financial institutions from the SWIFT network. For anyone unfamiliar, SWIFT is the messaging system that allows global banks to communicate and transfer funds rapidly.
Being kicked out of SWIFT is the modern equivalent of being put under a medieval siege.
That is a great way to put it. When the G7 and Western allies coordinate to lock an aggressor out of the global financial system, they are swinging the digital machaira. They are executing a non-kinetic form of wrath upon an entity doing evil.
Spot on, and this aligns perfectly with Chapter 23 of the Westminster Confession of Faith.
The chapter on the civil magistrate.
Yes, the confession states that God has armed the civil magistrate with the sword for the defense and encouragement of those that are good, and for the punishment of evildoers.
It is a clear mandate.
It is. The state is acting as a divinely appointed bridle against outward wickedness. This theological reality thoroughly refutes the seeker-sensitive pacifism that has crept into much of the modern church.
Yeah, you hear that a lot today.
You do. There is a popular liberal notion that any exercise of force or coercion is inherently unchristian. They think Jesus only wants us to be nice and tolerant. But the Reformed believer understands that the state has a divine appointment to protect the innocent from unprovoked aggression.
The world might say that authority is just a social contract agreed upon by citizens for mutual benefit. But the Bible says that the authority to punish evil is a divine mandate.
And the sanctions regime is a legitimate exercise of this mandate. It is the earthly magistrate attempting to fulfill their duty to restrain violence and protect life.
Okay, I get the theological concept of the magistrate's sword, but practically speaking, freezing bank accounts and putting a cap on the price of oil feels a bit like trying to catch water with a sieve.
It is a very complicated task.
Did the G7 really think they could just declare a maximum price for oil and the global market would comply? Why didn't they just enact a total, absolute embargo and refuse to let a single drop of Russian oil hit the ocean?
Well, if they had attempted a total blockade, pulling millions of barrels of oil off the market overnight, it would have caused a catastrophic global energy shock.
So it would backfire on the West.
Hugely. You have to remember how interconnected global commodities are. If that much supply vanishes, the price of Brent crude skyrockets. Gas prices hit $10 a gallon in the West.
Wow, $10 a gallon.
Easily. But the real devastation happens in poorer, developing nations where energy costs dictate the price of food. You would see mass starvation and total economic collapse in the third world.
So a total ban was never really on the table.
No. The explicit goal of the G7 and their Western allies was never an absolute airtight embargo. Instead, the strategy was controlled market access.
Controlled market access, okay.
They designed a mechanism to keep the oil flowing to third countries, stabilizing the global supply. But they only allowed it on terms that would drastically limit the revenue flowing back to the Kremlin. They wanted sanctions that would bite without breaking the global economy.
And that is where the price cap comes in.
Right. To do this, in December 2022, the coalition implemented a price cap mechanism. They capped Russian crude at $60 per barrel.
And then they dropped it later, right?
Yes, by mid-2025, the European Union lowered that cap even further to $47.60 per barrel. But, as you hinted, a price cap does not enforce itself. The coalition created specific friction mechanisms to make it work.
Friction is a great word for it. They didn't build a wall. They just, poured molasses on the highway.
That's a perfect analogy.
They created price friction by forcing Russian sellers to offer massive discounts to buyers. If a buyer knows you are desperate and locked out of normal markets, they will demand a bargain.
And they created service friction, too.
Right, by threatening to deny reputable Western insurance to any ship carrying oil sold above the cap. And they created logistical friction by forcing ships to take longer, far less efficient routes around the globe. Plus, they created legal friction by imposing severe penalties on anyone caught violating the rules.
Those friction mechanisms are a brilliant, modern illustration of what Reformed theology calls common grace.
Okay, let's break that down for the listener.
We find this articulated in Chapter 5 of the Westminster Confession, which deals with providence. Common grace is that sovereign favor of God, whereby he restrains the full outworking of human depravity and preserves the order of society.
Even among unbelievers.
Yes, even among those who do not acknowledge him. Through secondary causes like international trade constraints, price caps, and insurance regulations, God checks the hands of the violent.
I see.
Consider the source material regarding technological sanctions. The international community restricted the flow of advanced microchips and semiconductors. As a result, the aggressor was forced to scavenge basic components from household appliances.
Wait, really? Household appliances?
Yes. We are talking about military engineers literally pulling computer chips out of washing machines and refrigerators to repair drones and military hardware.
That is just wild to picture.
But it works. This degrades military capacity, it slows down the war machine, it saves innocent lives. God is using the convoluted web of global supply chains and economic policy as an instrument of his common grace to restrain evil.
That is a critical observation, especially when we push back on modern political assumptions. You will often hear secular politicians and pragmatic commentators suggest that if we can just fix the economy, we can fix the war.
They love that utopian narrative.
They really do. They present these sanctions as a utopian solution, a way to engineer permanent peace through financial pressure. They believe that rational economic incentives can cure the aggressive tendencies of nations.
But they miss the theological reality.
Totally. When you look at this through a reformed lens, you recognize that these temporal restraints are just that, temporal. A price cap on crude oil does not regenerate a human heart. A trade embargo on microchips does not eliminate the sinful desire to conquer and dominate.
It just puts a speed bump in front of them.
Well, precisely. These economic tools act as a bridle on the outward actions of the violent. They are necessary, and we should be incredibly grateful for them, but they are not a cure for the human condition.
But theological justification alone doesn't stop a 1,000-foot tanker. How did the coalition actually try to enforce this on the water? The logistics of moving millions of barrels of oil across the globe are staggering.
Oil does not just teleport.
No, it moves through a massive, highly integrated network of services. You have the ships themselves, the specialized marine insurance required to enter major ports, the brokers who arrange the sales, the financiers providing letters of credit, and the port authorities checking the paperwork.
It takes a village just to move one ship.
It does. To enforce the price cap, Western regulators essentially deputized private actors. They required ship owners, insurers, and brokers to collect invoices, attestations, and freight records.
Proving that the oil was bought below the cap.
Right. They had to prove the oil in a specific hull was purchased at or below the $60 cap. If a London-based insurer provided coverage for a cargo that was secretly sold for $80 a barrel, that insurer could face severe legal and financial penalties.
So the government forced the private sector to be the police.
Yes. The entire compliance model was layered, placing the burden of enforcement on the private companies facilitating the trade.
The coalition targeted a very specific vulnerability of any commodity exporting petrostate, and that is its absolute reliance on international high-trust logistics.
You need trust to move billions of dollars.
Right. If you export raw materials, you need the established, reliable maritime system to move your product efficiently. You need the big protection and indemnity clubs in London to ensure your voyage, or most major ports will not let you dock.
They will just turn you away.
So, by tying the price cap to the provision of Western maritime services, the G7 forced the targeted nation into a difficult choice. If you control the trusted channels of maritime commerce, the targeted nation must either accept lower profits within the regulated system or accept significantly higher costs and risks by stepping outside of it.
The strategy was to weaponize the petrostate's dependence on the global market.
But this raises an obvious question for you, the listener. If I am a billionaire oligarch, I am going to find a loophole.
Of course.
If the rules were so tight and the paperwork was so heavily monitored by deputized private actors, how does a nation successfully bypass the entire Western financial system? How do millions of barrels of oil continue to reach the market, generating billions in revenue, despite the sharpest economic sword the world has ever seen?
That question brings us from the bite of the law to the leak of the human heart. When restrictions are placed on a lucrative trade, substitute networks inevitably emerge to keep the cargo moving.
So the sanctions start to leak.
Yes, this is the reality of sanctions that leak. And the theological grounding for this leakage is the doctrine of total depravity. We look to Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 9, which states, "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked."
A famous verse, but very applicable here.
Very. The Hebrew word used for deceitful is akab. This word shares the same root as the name Jacob, the supplanter or the heel grabber.
The guy who was always trying to find an angle.
Exactly. I mean, spot on. It implies a fundamental crookedness, a persistent desire to bypass the straight path, to find a loophole. to trip up the righteous standard. When a heart is a cob, it will always seek a deceitful workaround to obtain what it desires.
So you are saying this global economic evasion is just human nature?
Yes. The leakage we see in international sanctions is a macroeconomic manifestation of this deceitful heart. It is the crookedness of human nature operating on a global scale.
You can see that crookedness vividly in the rise of middleman economies. The geopolitical source material points directly to transshipment hubs that have exploded in profitability since the sanctions began.
Nations that are suddenly doing a lot of business.
Oh, massive amounts. Nations like Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and the United Arab Emirates have become massive conduits for illicit trade. These nations act as the uneven ground where Western goods are laundered, repackaged, and shipped across the border for an enormous profit.
It is a giant laundering operation.
It really is. A shipment of restricted technology might leave a European port legally destined for a buyer in the UAE. The paperwork looks perfect. But once it arrives, it is quietly sold to a shell company, loaded onto a different plane or truck, and sent straight to the aggressor nation.
They braid the paper trail.
Right. These middleman hubs provide the shadows where the paper trail is intentionally broken. They facilitate the leak, ensuring that the war machine continues to receive the supplies it needs as long as the price is right.
This geopolitical reality absolutely shatters the theological error of the prosperity gospel.
That is an excellent point. Let's look at that.
The prosperity gospel equates wealth and financial success with God's favor and blessing. But we are witnessing massive, unprecedented global wealth being generated right now through illicit evasion, deceit, and the exploitation of a deadly, unprovoked conflict.
People are getting rich off of war.
Unbelievably rich. The brokers in these middleman economies are growing wealthy by facilitating the circumvention of laws designed to stop bloodshed. This is the idolatry of mammon overriding basic moral obligations.
So wealth does not equal righteousness.
Far from it. The unregenerate heart will gladly trade the lives of the innocent for a percentage of the profit on a barrel of smuggled oil. The generation of wealth in these transshipment hubs is not a sign of divine favor. It is a symptom of total depravity.
It just proves what the Bible has said all along.
Right. It proves that when financial incentives align with sinful desires, the human heart will engineer a way to bypass any legal restraint.
Let's break down specifically how this evasion happens on a practical level, because the mechanics of deceit are fascinating.
It is very technical, but very revealing.
It starts with documentary manipulation. The price cap relies entirely on paperwork to prove compliance. So the evasion networks just falsify the paperwork. They manipulate invoices to make it look like the oil was sold below the $60 cap.
But if they sell below the cap, how do they make their profit?
Well, they inflate the ancillary charges. They sell the oil at $50 to satisfy the cap, but then they bundle customs costs, they charge astronomical fees for freight, and they create phantom consulting fees.
Ah, so the total bill is still massive.
Right. By the time the buyer pays the total bill, they have paid well above the market rate. But the specific line item for the crude oil remains artificially low to satisfy the Western regulators.
That is incredibly deceptive.
And it gets worse. Furthermore, they use intense corporate layering. They set up anonymous shell companies in jurisdictions with high corporate secrecy. They use single-vessel fleets where every single ship is owned by a different, untraceable corporation.
Just a maze of paperwork.
Exactly. They change the management companies of these vessels constantly, sometimes multiple times in a single voyage. By the time a Western regulator identifies a suspicious vessel and tries to determine the beneficial owner, the ship has been sold on paper, renamed, and reflagged. They make beneficial ownership virtually impossible to trace.
The reason this works so effectively is due to the fragmentation of modern trade. Modern shipping relies on divisible services. As we noted, one company owns the ship, another manages the crew, a third provides the insurance, a fourth brokers the cargo, and a fifth handles the customs clearance.
Everyone just doing their own small part.
Right. When you distribute responsibility across so many different hands, spread across multiple international jurisdictions, the unregenerate conscience easily rationalizes sin. This divisible structure allows legitimate market actors to claim they unknowingly engaged in illicit transactions.
Plausible deniability.
Yes. An insurer in London can look at a falsified invoice provided by a broker in Dubai, issue a policy, and later claim they had no idea the freight charges were artificially inflated to hide a price cap violation.
They just look the other way.
They wash their hands of the moral responsibility because they only handled one small piece of the puzzle. The fragmentation of the industry provides a convenient hiding place for the conscience.
It is remarkably similar to a sophisticated money laundering scheme. Imagine a scenario where $1 million of illicit cash needs to be cleaned.
Okay.
Instead of one person depositing $1 million and setting off alarms, the syndicate uses 10,000 people to each wash a single $100 bill through a legitimate business. It is a process called smurfing.
Smurfing. That makes a lot of sense.
Right. Every individual participant can claim innocence. They can say, hey, I only handled a single bill. I didn't do anything wrong. Yet collectively, millions of dollars flow smoothly to fund a war machine.
So everyone feels innocent while doing something terrible.
That is the whole point. The divisible nature of maritime logistics allows for this precise type of moral deflection. Every broker, every port official, every insurance clerk only processes one piece of paper, allowing them to ignore the devastating reality of the whole picture.
And this brings us to the physical manifestation of this deceit, the shadow fleet.
Let's talk about the fleet.
We're not talking about a handful of rogue ships sneaking around in the dark. The source material estimates the shadow fleet comprises roughly 600 aging tankers.
600 massive ships.
Yes, and these vessels operate entirely outside of normal transparency standards. They engage in specific, highly deceptive maritime behaviors. For instance, they manipulate or completely disable their automatic identification systems, known as AIS.
What does the AIS do normally?
AIS is the transponder system that broadcasts a ship's location, speed, and identity to satellites and other vessels for safety and tracking. It is what keeps massive steel ships from colliding in the fog.
Ah, so it is a basic safety feature.
Right, but the Shadow Fleet tankers turn these transponders off, essentially going dark on the high seas. While dark, they conduct ship-to-ship, or STS, transfers.
Oh, wow. In the middle of the ocean.
Yes. They pull alongside another vessel in the middle of the ocean, connect massive hoses, and pump millions of gallons of crude oil from one ship to another. This blurs the chain of custody.
So they mix the oil to hide where it came from.
Precisely. The oil leaves a sanctioned port on one ship, vanishes from satellite tracking, is transferred to a second ship, and eventually arrives at a neutral port with a completely new set of paperwork claiming the oil originated elsewhere.
Hold on. If they are turning off their transponders, isn't that just a massive neon sign saying, I am doing something illegal? You would think naval authorities would just track the dark spots, but you paint a terrifying picture.
It is very dangerous.
The physical reality of these massive rusting steel tankers, spoofing their locations, grinding against each other in the ocean swells, transferring millions of gallons of oil in the dead of night. It is a perfect parallel to Job chapter 24, verse 13.
Let's hear the parallel.
The text speaks of those who are marad, or those who rebel against the light. Job describes the wicked who operate in the dark to hide their deeds, who refuse to walk in the paths of light.
That is a very fitting verse.
Just as the wicked in Job create false refuges in the physical darkness to hide from accountability, these shadow tankers operate in the physical darkness of the ocean, disabling their transponders to rebel against the light of legal transparency. They are creating a maritime false refuge.
They love the darkness because their deeds are evil.
Exactly. But this highlights the severe limits of secular, pragmatic solutions. The world looks at the shadow fleet and thinks the solution is just better technology. They think if we just launch more satellites or enforce stricter know-your-customer protocols in the banking sector, we will cure the issue.
But you cannot cure a spiritual heart condition with a better satellite.
No amount of technological surveillance can regenerate a soul. Human law, no matter how rigorously enforced by advanced technology, will always be as leaky as the unregenerate conscience it attempts to govern.
The pragmatic solution fails because it assumes the problem is a lack of information rather than a fundamental inclination toward deceit.
They think the system is broken, not the people.
Right. The actors operating the Shadow Fleet know the rules perfectly well. They possess the resourcefulness and the sinful desire to circumvent them. As long as the heart remains a quab deceitful and desperately wicked, it will find a way to operate in the dark.
So the shadow fleet is just a physical expression of that dark heart.
Yes, this is why the Shadow Fleet is not just a collection of rule breakers. It is a manifestation of an entirely parallel ecosystem.
That parallel ecosystem is terrifying when you look at the scale of it. The shadow fleet represents a fully functioning substitute infrastructure. Because these vessels cannot use reputable Western registries, they use flags of convenience from nations like Gabon or Panama.
Which means very little oversight.
Exactly. What does it mean to be flagged in Gabon? It means Gabon is technically responsible for your safety inspections. Do they have the capacity to thoroughly inspect a rusting hull floating off the coast of Greece?
Of course not.
Because they cannot access top-tier insurance markets in London or New York, they rely on unknown, untested, or entirely fraudulent insurance providers. They have built an alternative supply chain that mirrors the legitimate global market, but operates with virtually zero oversight.
By stepping outside of the trusted, top-tier insurers and recognized classification societies, those are the organizations that inspect ships to ensure they are structurally sound. These shadow actors externalize an immense hazard onto coastal states.
A physical danger?
A huge one. Many of these 600 tankers are incredibly old, poorly maintained, and prone to mechanical failure. If one of these rust bucket tankers, carrying 1 million barrels of crude oil, runs aground or collides with another vessel in a busy shipping lane, the resulting environmental catastrophe would be staggering.
And who pays for that?
Well, because their insurance is fraudulent or issued by a shell company with no actual capital, the coastal state where the spill occurs will be left holding the bill for the cleanup. The local taxpayers pay the price.
That is just awful.
It illustrates a theological point about the natural progression of sin. What begins as private greed, the desire to evade a price cap for a few extra dollars per barrel, rapidly metastasizes into a massive public hazard.
Sin never stays private.
No, it does not. The sin of the individual actors creates a literal physical threat to the marine environment and the safety of global shipping lanes. Sin is never truly private. It always eventually externalizes its damage onto the innocent.
You can see the regulators realizing this reality as you trace the historical timeline of the Western response. They quickly recognized that paperwork compliance was failing miserably.
Yeah.
The sword of the magistrate had to strike harder.
A chair had to swing.
Right. On January 10th, 2025, the U.S. Treasury took massive action, sanctioning major Russian energy firms like Gazprom Neft and Surgutneftegas, along with over 180 vessels and traders.
That is a huge escalation.
It was. They shifted from telling companies to check the paperwork to actively dismantling the networks facilitating the trade. The European Union escalated dramatically as well. In their 14th sanctions package in mid-2024, they introduced sweeping port bans.
Banning the ships entirely.
Yes, and by the time they passed their 18th package in July 2025, they had designated nearly 600 vessels, systematically trying to strip the shadow fleet of its ability to dock, repair, or resupply anywhere in Europe.
This escalation is the earthly authority attempting to enforce its will on a rebellious system. When the bridle of the law is ignored, when the legal friction fails to deter the deceitful heart, the magistrate must swing the sword with greater force.
They have to use physical force.
Yes. We see this culminating in a highly significant event on March 25, 2026. The United Kingdom authorized its armed forces and law enforcement officers to physically board and interdict sanctioned shadow fleet vessels transiting the English Channel and UK waters.
Wow, military boarding.
This is a monumental shift. The state moved from the abstract realm of digital ledgers and compliance attestations to the kinetic reality of physical maritime denial. Picture Royal Marines descending onto a rusting tanker in the middle of the channel.
That is intense.
Armed military personnel boarding a ship to stop illicit trade is the clearest possible expression of the Mashera. It is the state recognizing that when dealing with resolute human depravity, paperwork is insufficient. Physical force becomes necessary to restrain the evil.
Yet, despite military boardings and hundreds of sanctioned vessels, the sanctions still leak. Why? Because human systems possess built-in limitations. It's a massive game of international whack-a-mole.
A very expensive game.
The G7 coalition faces massive geographic and temporal realities. Geographically, the coalition is incredibly influential, but it is not universal. Trade simply shifts into jurisdictions that do not apply the same scrutiny.
The ships just go somewhere else.
Right. If European ports are closed, the ships sail to ports in Asia or the Middle East that welcome the discounted oil. Temporally, there is a massive time lag. An evasion network can change a ship's name, transfer its ownership to a new shell company in Cyprus, and raise a new flag of convenience overnight.
While the government takes months to do anything.
Exactly. Meanwhile, it takes Western governments months to investigate the new corporate structure, gather the legal evidence, and coordinate a joint sanctions response among allied nations. The regulators are always playing a game of catch-up against an adversary that can change its identity in hours.
The underlying drive that fuels this relentless adaptation is the profit incentive. As long as legitimate maritime services demand strict compliance, a massive financial premium arises for the murky actors willing to accept the legal and environmental risks.
The risk pays well.
It does. The more difficult the G7 makes the trade, the more money a shadow broker can charge to facilitate it. This brings us back to the Westminster Confession, Chapter 6, which states that humanity is wholly undisposed, disabled, and made opposite to all good.
We are drawn to the bad.
Yes. Because the human heart is fundamentally inclined towards selfish gain, new replacement networks will always generate faster than coalition enforcement can suppress them. The profit motive, fueled by total depravity, provides an endless supply of willing participants to rebuild the broken links in the evasion chain.
There is always someone willing to take the cash.
Always. No human system can fully contain a market driven by the idolatrous pursuit of wealth.
So we arrive at the mixed verdict on the global stage. Are these historical sanctions failing, or are they succeeding?
It is a complicated answer.
The honest geopolitical verdict is that it is a mixed reality. The sanctions are absolutely working as a system of friction and cost imposition. They have forced Russia to spend billions assembling the shadow fleet. They have slashed profit margins by forcing heady discounts.
But they haven't stopped the flow of oil.
No, they fall short of full containment. Russia's oil trade has not been eradicated, it has just been altered. It has been pushed out of the sunlight of reputable, top-tier commerce and forced into the shadows of opaque, high-risk logistics. The bite is real, but the leak is substantial.
To summarize the earthly reality, we must harbor no illusions. We support the magistrate's efforts to penalize evil. We are grateful for the common grace that restrains the aggressor's capacity for violence through economic friction.
We definitely praise God for that restraint.
Yes. But we know that sanctions can only constrain trade. They cannot corner the human heart. The shadows still carry a great deal of oil because the shadows are where the unregenerate man is most comfortable.
That is a sobering thought.
It is, which is why we must transition our focus from the geopolitical tension of the present moment to the Christian hope of the future. We operate from a premillennial and dispensational framework.
We are looking ahead.
Yes. We look forward to the day when the Lord Jesus Christ returns to rule the nations with a rod of iron. We contrast the leaky, imperfect, easily bypassed justice of the G7 with the absolute, inescapable justice of Christ.
Yes, justice won't have loopholes.
None at all. He is the light of the world, and under his reign, no deception will stand. No falsified invoice will hold up in his court. No shell company will obscure the truth of a man's actions. When Christ rules, no shadow fleet will find a safe port anywhere in creation.
That is the definitive hope we rest on. But before we sign off, I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to consider. If the global trade of massive physical commodities like million-barrel oil tankers is this easily manipulated by deceitful paperwork and opaque shell companies today, what happens tomorrow?
When things go digital.
Right. What happens when evasion goes entirely digital? As we move rapidly toward decentralized currencies, blockchain-obscured transactions, and AI-generated documentation that can forge a perfect paper trail in seconds, we are building a world where truth in the marketplace is entirely subjective and infinitely malleable.
A very dark prospect.
It forces us to ask, are we preparing our own hearts for a system where deception is not just a loophole, but the default setting of the global economy? Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We encourage you to continue viewing the daily news, the economic shifts, and the geopolitical conflicts through the clear lens of Scripture. This concludes today's discussion for Reformed Thinking.